Well, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Paddock Paradise. Danielle references it quite a bit. It's how we house our horses, and it's maybe a process you might want to emulate. Hello, here we are in the upper portion of our Paddock Paradise Horse Track, and this is how we contain our horses. This is how we keep our horses in shape. Now, some of you may have seen Danielle refer to it or seen it on different videos, but we'd like to go more in depth on how we built it, the different factors you need to consider, because there's a lot to consider. One thing to consider, first of all, where you're going to put it. If you already have a pasture, you can actually just line the outside of that pasture with a track system based on some of the principles that you'll learn today. But most importantly, you need to figure out some way to contain the horses. Now, this is what we chose here. You don't have to do this, but we use a poly rope system. Now, the reason I use poly rope is one of the issues we have here is we have a lot of trees through our forest. We have a lot of thunderstorms. We have tree fall all the time. When trees fall down or branches fall down or whatever, this rope will stretch and a tree can fall, this tree right here can fall on this rope and it won't break. Wire breaks all the time. The other thing we like about this poly rope is it's very, very visible. It's white and red marks on here, white and black down there, but it's very visible for the horses. It's also visible for us. You don't be walking through the woods and bump your head on this. But these poly ropes come in a bunch of different brands. I recommend you research the brands. You're going to get what you pay for. We started out with cheaper brands and we went to more expensive brands. One of the reasons we did that is because of the resistance, okay? And I don't want to go into electrical engineering or anything, but these poly ropes have a resistance. So let's say it says 25 miles or this many miles or that many miles. What you're looking at is the ohms, and that tells you how much resistance you have through this to see whether your charger can actually run this length. We've got a couple miles of rope here, and that may not seem a whole lot for wire, but it's very important how many strands of wire are in this rope. A lot of strands of wire, stainless steel or copper even better, means you're going to have lower resistance, means that you can do longer runs and not lose as much voltage. So when we start out at say 12,000 volts, we want to finish up with at least 4,000 to 6,000 volts, because anything below that really doesn't give them a shock. So you want to check the beginning of your run and the end of your run. And if there's too much resistance, it may be a short, it may be too many weeds touching the rope, but it just may be that the rope is not high quality rope. So let's go take a look at a few other things. Okay, so we've got the poly rope along T-posts. And as you can see, you need a lot of T-posts. We were lucky, we got some cheap out in Colorado and hold them here. T-posts are great, but you've got to be careful because they can be dangerous. The top of T-post can seriously tear up a horse or even impale a horse. So all of our T-posts are capped with these round caps that hold the poly rope, but you can also get a rubber cap and put a poly rope holder right below that rubber cap. Either way, make sure the top of that T-post is covered to protect your horses. We use different T-post wire holders or poly rope holders, and we make them adjustable. We like to basically move them up and down based on the different slope of the land as it goes up and down. We want to make sure a horse doesn't try to duck under that. But for the most part, these are a standard height all the way down. Now, if you also look behind me, you'll see that this is 15 feet wide, or I'll tell you it's 15 feet wide. The width is very important. Horses do not like to be confined. So when you make that pathway thinner, it encourages them to move and not stand still. And if you look down this path as we walk down it, there's really no manure here, because when it's thin, they want to move. And that's what causes the Paddock Paradise advantage over a pasture where they're okay with an open pasture. They're not forced to move. But on a thin alleyway, it's like a box canyon or a thin canyon. They can't see out, and so they want to continue to move. Now, you can't make it too thin, because if you have a passive horse and a couple dominant horses, you always need to allow that horse to have an out, a way to escape. And if it's too thin, they can't. So we have draft horses. We go with 15 feet. Smaller horses probably go to 10 feet. But you don't want to go too narrow or too wide, because too wide and they're just going to hang out and they're not going to move. The whole idea of the track is to create as much of a natural environment for the horse as you can. We don't have our bottom lines really low, because we actually encourage the horses to reach underneath the fence and forage some of the weeds and the grasses that are along the edge. First of all, it keeps the lines clear, and second of all, it gives them nutritional value. Realize they'll also forage other things like trees. They may chew the bark off your trees, depending on what minerals they're looking for in their diet. And that is sometimes going to kill the tree. And you'll have to take care of that by cutting it down and getting it cleared out. The other things you'll notice is when you make these tracks, you're going to have erosion, because if they're constantly on this, they're going to clear the forage from this area. And as you can see here, we have a little terrace system. We did a cross slope here because if you go directly down the slope, you're going to get a lot of erosion when it rains. We've also put logs downhill. When I cut this dead tree down, I'll lay its trunk downhill, and dirt will back up on the back side of that and keep it from eroding the rest of the way.
This is a great example of how I dropped this tree and I left it perpendicular to the slope of this terrain. And as you can see, the dirt backed up on the uphill side of it, and the horses have created a little path here and a little step down. And this again prevents erosion, because it prevents this dirt from being washed away. It also creates a little bit of an obstacle for the horses. They have to watch their feet, and they have to, again, practice balance, much unlike a very flat, manicured pasture or stall or arena. Whenever you build a track system or a Paddock Paradise system, you want to carefully consider where you want your gates. Now, the advantage of poly rope is if you don't have a gate, you can make it really quick. If you have a gate, you can close that off and put it somewhere else. These gates are access points not only for you to bring feed, it's also areas where you can actually isolate certain sections of the track off and have free access here and restricted access here, or separate horses. So consider the width of your gate to be big enough to get vehicles through, whatever you're bringing down there. Also consider that if you take these gate handles off, you could take them across the track and actually divert a section of the track and have horses go a certain way. So there's a lot to think about with gates. But again, go back to the resistance, the overall resistance. Make sure these handles and all the gate attachments have a good flow of electricity. If your gate clicks, that means that you've got a lot of resistance there and you're losing voltage on the track. All right, we're down in the lowest part of the track. It's also our water source. And it's been very dry, so it's just a trickle here, a very low trickle. But a couple of key points about this area. First of all, it's wide. It is an area where they can congregate because this is where they drink. Second of all, we have brick lining the edges here for erosion control, and that leads right up to their drinking pond. Now, because of the drought, you see a mucky green slop-filled, algae-filled drinking pond. It's not always that way. It's just a few weeks out of the year, or sometimes a month out of the year. We also provide an alternate source of water when it gets that way, but the horses typically just start drinking out of the stream down here where the algae isn't. Sometimes it'll really flood coming down through that pipe, and this really spreads out wide, so you got to be careful what you put down here. We've particularly got these rubber mats here right now because we have a rehab case, a horse who's hooves are a little bit tender right now, so we provide her a way to get across the creek. And we can keep an eye on things, and if she starts crossing over there, then we can pull these up and take them back because she doesn't need them anymore. But some people say, well, the horse is never going to pick or choose to walk across these bricks. That's terrible. Well, a horse with a good, healthy, sound hoof, they'll walk across this every day. They really don't care to use the mats. Now, sometimes they have preferred routes and stuff like that, but these bricks do not hurt the horse's hooves, because if you think about in the wild, especially out west where a lot of wild Mustangs are, this is very common ground, very rocky, very sandy, very hard. And the horses, quite honestly, they'll cross wherever they feel comfortable, and it might be right over the brick, and most of the time it is. Here. There's a spot down here that stays wet for most of the year. Even in this very dry spell, it's still wet. That's actually good, because the horses, they can have conditions where it's too dry for their hooves and it's too wet for their hooves. Cause all sorts of conditions. As they walk through this area, it's moist, it's soft, it's very soothing on their feet. And so you can see this is mostly sand down here. It's a nice sandy soil, and this is more mud up here. But it's kind of I don't know, it's kind of like lotion for the feet. It gives a little moisture to them. Well, as luck would have it, we've run into some horses. So let's talk a little bit about what they're doing here. These are the hay nets that we use hanging from our trees. We move these nets around. As you can see, they're tied to the tree, and that could damage the tree, even kill the tree. So we adjust it up and down or move it from tree to tree to make sure there's no damage, and that's just baling twine right there. The bags are not too heavily loaded because, again, that can rip the bark off. But even though these horses are all eating out of the same bag, you really need to consider something. When Grace first arrived here, Flash did not like her anywhere near the feeding station. And so Flash would chase her off, and Grace would go to another bag, and she'd chase her off again in another bag. So you have to be very strategic about hanging multiple bags where the horses feed. At least the number of bags as horses, maybe even more, but spread them far enough apart that bullied horse can actually get to a bag and not be chased off by the dominant horse. But close enough, because Grace, even though she was being bullied when she first showed up, she didn't want to be away from the horses. So she would essentially stand there, even though there was a bag down the track that she could eat, she didn't want to leave her friends. Well, that's all gone now, and they can all eat out of the same bag, so I don't have to be as strategic on where I hang them. But I do have to be careful to continue to move these bags, because not only can they be damaged up there, they'll be damaged down here where the horses are rubbing against the tree. So watch your trees and move those bags frequently. I want to stop here for a second, talk a little bit more about the bales now that we don't have horses surrounding us. First and foremost, the reason we use these slow feed nets is we don't want the horses to congregate in a given area. We used to have a big plenty feeder down here, and I could put 7-8 bales of hay in there. I could even load a round bale in there, and they could eat that for a week or so. But the problem with that is, again, the whole idea of the track system is to get the horses moving and to get them out of mucky areas and to get them to forage like they would in the wild. We're trying to create an environment that's like nature. And in nature, horses don't gather around a feeder and eat all day. And they don't go over to a trough and drink all day. They wander around and look for forage. And so moving these bags around is one way to do that. Now, a couple precautions with these. First of all, you want them high enough. See, when they're full, they kind of sit up high, and then when they get eaten down, they fall down low. Now, my kids, because they bring the hay down a lot, they like to move these lower, and I like to move them higher, because you don't want the horses getting caught in this. And I will say this, if they have shoes, they will almost definitely get caught in these bags, and that's not a good thing. We keep all our horses barefoot, so we have no shoes down here. I always have old baling twine on there, and as you know, I try to protect the trees, but the great thing about that is if a horse does get caught, it breaks the baling twine pretty easy. and sometimes we will find a bag on the ground, but we will always, every single day we're down here to make sure we don't leave those on the ground. Now, you do see some litter on the ground, and that's another advantage of moving around. But the other thing is, we don't leave a bunch of full bags down here and let them eat for a week. We actually come down every single day. We monitor how much they're eating, and we make sure that they don't have like 3 or 4 days of food. They only have about a day. We want them to eat these bags down and clean up so that it's more efficient. And it works really well here. Now this is an area of the track that's kind of unavoidable, and we're trying to work on it. This is a steep part of the track, and we thought, well, as long as we don't come straight down the hill, we'll be okay. But we still have erosion here, and mainly because this is pure sand. This is like the sand that you buy at Lowe's or something. It's beach sand. And so when it rains, it erodes. But it's a great place for the horses to roll. Even though this is a steep hill, this stuff is so thick with sand, they love to lay down and roll right in the middle of a big hill. But we're trying to come up with different solutions on trying to keep the sand in place on a steep grade. Definitely don't want to come straight down the hill, but even though we S-turn down this hill, we still get some erosion. So now we're approaching the highest part of the track. And so what we're doing is we're widening up the pathway from 15 feet to about almost 50 feet. And we've also put a shelter up here. When you widen it up, the horses feel safer. They can maneuver, they can see. When they're higher up, they can see further. So this is the relaxing area. So let's go up and take a look at the shelter. As we walk up, you'll see a lot of manure here. Again, this is a lounging area. This is where they hang out. This is where they feel safe. So you'll see a lot more manure. We haven't cleaned it in months, but it basically composts right into the surrounding area, and it really doesn't smell at all up here, and you don't see a whole bunch of flies. I want you to look here at the pit area. The horses have used this as a rolling area so much that they actually have created a pit here, and here's an imprint of a horse right here. But this is almost like a bed for them. They love to come up and just lay and roll, and we'll come up and they'll just be lounging flat out on the ground. It's just a self-created bed area, I guess, but they love it. Now, the shelter itself, we did a lot of research on shelters, and long story short, Cornell University discovered that horses really don't use shelter to shelter from the elements. They use it to shelter from insects. When you have a track system like this, there's a lot of other ways they can get away from insects. They can go to certain tree lines, they can go up, they can go down. If it's cold, they can go to a certain sunny spot. If it's hot, they can go to a shady spot. Horseflies congregate in certain areas and don't congregate in other areas. So we spent a lot of time getting this shelter up here, and they rarely, if ever, use the shelter, because when we come up here, they're lounging. Notice we have an outlet on the side. One other thing from the study, Cornell University realized that a lot of times the horses use the outside of the shelter as a block for wind, or again, something with insects, but they don't use the inside so much. So we made sure that no horses ever got trapped there. And so what we use the shelter for is actually, you'll see in that back corner and down there, we have mineral boxes and a salt block. Well, it keeps it dry. And so they'll come up here, and while they're lounging around, they'll go in and they'll get their mineral. By the way, I just want to point out, this shelter has been here for 2 full years, and we have never cleaned manure from this shelter. And there has never been a single nugget of horse manure inside the shelter. So this is another area of erosion. On a camera, it's never easy to see slope, but this is a pretty steep slope. And it was kind of unavoidable how we designed the track in our property line, which is about 5 feet that way, that we're going to have a steep slope here. But it's actually good for the horses because it builds a lot of muscle for them to come up and down this slope. And they do quite often run up and down this slope. So as we come down here, you'll see just how steep it is. Well, Well, as luck would have it, we come down here and we find a tree that's leaning over the rope. I'm going to have to cut that up and get it off the rope. But I want to point something out here too. When this tree fell down, I cut it up in place and I left it there. This is a natural environment, okay? Horses don't always have the yellow brick road where it's perfectly flat and just manicured. We want them to pick up their feet. We want them to be aware of their surroundings. We want them to have good coordination. So if there are things in their way, they have to negotiate those. That comes really in handy when my wife goes out on trail rides. Our horses have no problem going over rocks, through streams, over logs. They don't back up or hesitate or hop over them. They simply walk over them. Why? Because every single day they see logs in their path and they walk casually over them. When you have a long, long stretch, especially down deep in the woods, it's very important to have brakes with switches. These switches are good. You can turn off the top line, you can turn off the bottom line, or you can turn off both of them, and they're really easy to actuate. This is great when you're repairing things. When I have a downed tree and I have to shut off just a section of the track, I can shut off that section, work on it. If I just want to work on the bottom, I can shut off just the bottom and work on that. It's essential not having to walk a quarter mile back up the hill up to the house. It's quite a hike to get up there. And a lot of times I'll station a person with a radio up there to turn on and off the fence, but if I'm working on a section back here, I'll just do it myself. Now we're down to the portion of Paddock Paradise we call the Straightaway. When we initially started Paddock Paradise, we did it in our pasture, and we did it around the perimeter. And one particular part of the pasture followed the driveway, and it was not quite a quarter mile, but it was a pretty long stretch. And it was relatively straight. It had a slight curve in it. But what we found was the horses, for some reason, maybe they were just plain, but they would go down to one end and they would sprint full speed down to the other end. And then they would trot back and they would sprint full speed. They really, really enjoyed having a very long straightaway to run sprints on. So when we built this down in the woods, we said we need a long straight area, and this is about the size of our driveway, nearly a quarter mile of straight road. In fact, if you look down here, this is asphalt. This used to be a trail from well over 100 years ago, during Lincoln's time, when he did a lot of surveying around here. It later became a blacktop road that connected Petersburg and Athens. Well, this road was ceased, or it was closed in the 1960s, somewhere around the 1960s. So for over a half a century it's been closed, but we found it when we bought the property and then found the history of it. So I guess you could call this Lincoln's Trail, really. But it's an asphalt road that goes through our woods, and this is great too because it's yet another surface for the horses. We have sand, and we saw that before. We have mud, we have rock, we have 2-inch gravel, we have bricks, and we have asphalt. So the horse's hooves see every kind of surface. The other advantage of that is when it's hot or cold or rainy or dry, the horses can retreat to different areas of the track and not be stuck in mud like a muddy paddock or a muddy pasture or something. They can always, always, always find a dry spot in the wet. They can find a warm spot, a cool spot, or whatever. And these different surfaces are really great for the hooves. Alright, here we're in what we call the canyon area. You see it's a little bit darker. The sides of the trail go up on both sides. Horses don't like to hang out in areas like this. So this is pretty much a thoroughfare where they keep on moving. And as you can see, we haven't scraped this track in about 2 months. There's not a whole lot of manure here. Horses generally manure in certain spots on the track. So let's head up further and see if we can find what we call a stud pile. Now we're approaching the top of the hill. Well, obviously the top of the hill is where horses can look out and see things, and as you can see, we're seeing more and more manure or stud piles. And you know, horses generally they sniff the ground and stuff like that. If one horse slows down and goes to the bathroom, it instigates all the others to do so. So in this area, we'll generally see a lot of manure collecting, and it's always pretty much the same area, but it depends on season. Sometimes the stud pile is down there because they spend more time down there. But this particular area is on the way to the end, which we have kind of figured out is a place where horseflies don't congregate. And so in the summertime when horseflies get bad, for some reason they go down to the end here and the horseflies aren't there. So let's take a look at that. Well, this is what is our only dead end on the track. This and up by the gate where we actually let them back to the barn. So whenever you consider having a dead end to a track, don't make it a dead end, make it a cul-de-sac if you can. And what we've done is we have somewhat of a rounded open area here. You don't want horses to run down and, again, dominant horses start beating up on less dominant horses. So give them an out, give them a way to get around. In fact, this is where we used to have the Clenny feeder, and it gave them plenty of space to get around the feeder so nobody was penned in. But now, again, like I've said, this seems to be a place where they congregate and hang out during the day, and it gets them away from the horseflies. I do not know why the horseflies don't come down here. It may be some of the forage, or maybe it's away from a water source or something like that. But this is where they hang out in the summertime. There's some manure here over in the corner, and there's quite a bit of shade back in this area too. So it's noticeably darker in this area, even in the middle of the day when the sun is directly overhead. It's a pretty thick canopy up there. Well, I think that about covers our Paddock Paradise. There are some other little things. Of course, you can always ask questions and get online and see if we can answer any. And we have had other designs and tried other methods that probably didn't work so well, so we didn't incorporate them here. But if you think about horses that are stalled, there's a lot of issues. There's colic, there's cribbing, there's thrush. A horse has to be physically and mentally challenged and entertained at all times to stay in good shape. Now, we don't have to take our horses out in the springtime and train them for 3 or 4 months in order to get them to plow a field, because when they're on a system like this, they're constantly moving, they're constantly conditioning themselves, they're constantly in shape. And the other thing is, we don't have a problem with cribbing or wind sucking or colic or things like that, because again, they're constantly moving, they're mentally stimulated. We actually have bobcat and coyotes and owls and all sorts of things out here, and yes, that is mental stimulation. And also the wind blowing and trees falling and having to walk over stones and rocks and things like that. There's not a lot of boredom here for the horses, and so we don't have those behavioral issues that other people have. I would highly recommend you consider looking into something like this and doing whatever you can to create a more natural environment for the horses. Because you can see, they certainly love it. Well, thanks again for watching. We love learning here at Redgate Farm, and we hope that we can share some of that knowledge with you. If you want more detailed knowledge of what we're doing and aspects of how we do things, visit our Patreon site. You can see the link below.